to see him in a believing and content heart. He was calm and meditative. His life was often marked by quietness at this point. He lived a righteous life, a confident life, a grateful life, and a faithful life. In Psalms chapter 57 and verse 7, and I'll go ahead and read that one. Psalms chapter 57 verse 7 states, "My heart is fixed, O God. My heart is fixed. I will sing and give praise." This is what David looked on the inside. And we should ask the question, does our heart look like this? Because this is indeed why God chose him to be the new king of Israel. God's choice is characterized by heavenly recognition. And the ways of knowing that David was in God's choice as he was anointed was by just that. He was anointed with oil. He had an anointed ministry. And we'll go ahead and read in 1 Samuel chapter 16, skipping back to 1 Samuel. Chapter 16, verse 13. "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward." Again, he had an anointed ministry. God had designated David to lead his people. Okay. He was crowned as the king. There was a relationship that we begin to see between Saul and David after this point. If you follow the story of David, you quickly see as him leading, as him becoming this warrior in his own right, as he went to fight the Philistines, and the triumph between David as he trusted the Lord to guide him, and he felled the giant Goliath. And at this point, Saul became aware of David. And as their lives begin to intertwine, we begin to see the differences between these two men, both of whom were originally chosen by God, one of whom decided to live according to his own authority and to just follow God's will. The other to in all things follow him, regardless of how hard that made his life, regardless of where it took him. And I'm going to go ahead and move over to, I think, the first handout that you have. We're going to look at David and the Psalms, the king, the shepherd, the songwriter, the worshiper, the prophet, the warrior, and the sinner. And if you guys have this handout right here. And before we go into some more outstanding events in David's reign, I want us to go over this handout specifically because a lot of Psalms, though it was written later in his life, I believe ties back into in those early days when he was not but a shepherd. And how that began to affect how he saw God leading him and guiding him. I'll go ahead and read the first part, and then as we go to the blanks, I'll have you guys tell me what you put in there, how you fill those out. There are two historical reasons that point to David's ability to write most of the Psalms. He was closely associated with Samuel while a young boy. This association would often bring him into contact with many schools of prophets. And subjects such as sacred poetry were probably stressed to those students. He had a very good education growing up. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13, it says that the Spirit of the Lord was upon David from the time of his anointing. So he would indeed receive divine inspiration and assistance in writing both the Psalms and other books. The instruction and anointing of the Spirit is essential to writing the poetry that we now read in the Psalms. He was well qualified to write these books, these songs. Below is a summary of his qualifications. If you guys can go ahead, he was a skillful what? What is in that first blank? If you guys have that. They were supposed to put this out.
No, you're telling me.
Ah, very well. Okay. My apologies. He was a skillful musician. So if you guys want to go ahead and fill that in with the blank, a musician. He had a sense of rhythm, an ear for pleasing sounds, and the ability to invent new instruments.
This musician, he was a skillful.
And of course, if you, if we'll go ahead, do you do questions at the end or during? Okay. The next one, he was a man of deep feeling. It is seen in the love for Jonathan, the son of Saul, and in his grateful appreciation for the courageous feats of his men that he led throughout his life and that would follow him even during the time of Saul trying to destroy, to capture, to kill David, and his fondness for Absalom, his own son. Number 3, he was an enthusiastic worshiper of Jehovah. He was devoted to the God of Israel, and in the midst of his dangers and disappointment, he looked to Jehovah for strength. There are many verses in the Bible that mention David against all odds, worshiping God even when it seemed all hope was lost, or if it seemed to be an inappropriate time. He truly believed that worship was one of the most important aspects of living a holy life for God. He was a victim of so many varied experiences, is the fourth blank. Experiences. Never could it be said that David lived a boring life. Number 5, he had many personal virtues, which are indeed reflected in the Psalms. He was a personable youth. There were many people who, even though they would make fun of him, he was still thought of as, well, this is a young man that we can trust. He was careful in his conduct in the court of King Saul. If you want to go ahead and turn the page. He had a friendly disposition to all people. He had a forgiving spirit, even when those who wronged him, as of course Saul did multiple times. We see throughout his life, David would continually forgive Saul for what he had done, saying that he is the Lord's chosen and I cannot harm him. David's character had much diversity. He was a warrior, for that first blank. A musician. He was a saint.
The second, the musician.
Second one is musician, yes. Third is a saint.
Saints.
Saint, S-A-I-N-T, yes. Fourth is prophet. Fifth is resemblance to Jesus Christ. And sixth is a sinner. All these descriptions apply to David's character. He was so diverse in his life that he was able to see different aspects of what it meant to serve God and what it meant to be a man after God's own heart. He wrote the Psalms at a time in which religious poetry was accepted. And as we read that the political and religious reforms and atmosphere which Samuel established created the sense of natural and religious patriotism. Again, at this point, when he wrote these books, this was one of the highest points that the Israelites had ever lived in during their history. Music played an important part, and David's own personal victories prompted him to write of what the Lord had helped him with. You go ahead and can continue to read through that handout if you'd like, but we're going to go ahead and go to the next one. David, a man after God's own heart. This is what it looks like. And if you've turned to the right handout, we'll go ahead and go over each of these blanks and describe them in turn. In 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14, which I'm going to go ahead and read just one more time. Chapter 13 and verse 14. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. This was, of course, in reference to Saul. And we see that here David was believed to be this man. David's anointing showed that God had chosen him. But God's choice can often be considered contrary to human reasoning. That's the answer to the first two blanks and the first question. Human reasoning. So you want to go ahead and fill that out.
That's the first one.
Yes, that is the first one.
Contrary to.
Human reasoning. Regardless of what Samuel or Jesse considered to be what looked and acted like a king, God had chosen someone different. God's choice is based on the heart. That's the answer to the second blank, the heart. And as we read Psalms chapter 23, we see that each verse portrays an aspect of David's heart. He had a believing heart. That's what you write after verse 1. A believing heart, yes. Verse 2. He had a calm or meditative heart.
A meditative heart.
Yes, meditative heart. Verse 3 showed him to have a righteous heart.
A righteous heart.
A righteous heart. Verse 4 showed him to have a confident heart. Verse 5 showed him to have a grateful heart. And last, verse 6 showed him to have a faithful heart. If any of these blanks, if you need to go back and ask for clarification or to understand what it was, just let me know. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and move to Psalms chapter 57 and verse 7. Would someone like to read that?
Psalm 57 verse 7.
So, yes.
My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, O harp and Israel. I will awake the dawn. Oh, that's verse 6. Is it just verse 7?
Sorry, I'm just going to look real quick. Yes, Psalms chapter 57 and verse 7.
My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody.
Okay. My heart is fixed. Oh God. Fixed is the answer to that blank. His heart was set. It would not be changed. He knew what he believed, and he knew that he followed God and none else. Okay, the last two blanks on this particular handout. We can see that God's choice, if we turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 16, it's characterized by heavenly recognition. Not man's recognition, not human reasoning as we would dictate, but God's choice is characterized by heavenly recognition. Those are the final two blanks.
What's that?
Heavenly recognition. Okay. There were three phases of David's reign. I don't know if these handouts were these a part of it as well. Okay. You'll see, and this on the back of this, you'll see the authors of the Psalms. David wrote 73. Asaph wrote 12 of the Psalms. The sons of Korah wrote 11. Solomon, David's son, wrote 2 of the Psalms. And Moses and Ethan both wrote 1 psalm. This only counts for 100 psalms. The other third of the book remains anonymous, though the possibility is that David wrote some of them. We're moving on to the 3 phases of David's reign. The beginning, or David's triumphs, can be found in 2 Samuel chapter 1 through chapter 9. This was his rise as he accomplished many of the things that God gave him in order to do. As he began to show both to the Israelites and to himself that he was indeed the anointed of God, the next king of Israel. Then we move on to the second phase, David's troubles, found in 2 Samuel chapter 10 through 21, and we see his fall and many of the mistakes that even a man after God's own heart can make. And if we remember, it follows a very similar timeline as Saul, but the difference being that David repented. The third phase was David's testimony, found in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 24, and his restoration. We're going to move on to some outstanding events in David's reign. And I'll go over these quickly. He was twice crowned king, both of Judah and Israel. He did not become king, however, until after Saul's death. He had been anointed as a young boy, but he had a long time to wait before he actually achieved being king of Israel. He was only at first crowned king of Judah, because Saul still had surviving sons. But David continued to wait.
Where are you going, please?
Sorry. Is this a handout that they have? Okay. This is the outstanding events in David's reign. It's another handout that you should have. And as you were giving these handouts, I would suggest that you look into these for even more clarification. If you want to read it, if you want to study a little bit more about what exactly made David's reign as successful as it was. David only became commander after Ishubeth became weak and two of his own captains slew him. Finally, at that point, Israel realized that David was their own flesh. He was one of their own. That David was indeed the victorious captain during Saul's reign. That David, most importantly, was ordained of the Lord. And that David should be king of all Israel. The lesson to be learned throughout this is that David, one of his greatest characteristics, he would not touch God's anointed. Even given the chance when he could have killed Saul, he did not. And he was kind to Saul's family even after the death of King Saul. He captured Jebus, which would eventually become Jerusalem, and made it his capital city. Joshua had not captured the city, so it was up to David to capture it from the Jebusites. Of course, now we know Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel and of great importance throughout the history of the Israelites. He captured it with God's approval and help. The lesson is that ungodly people may laugh at our weaknesses, but with God's help, we are always victorious. David, in turn, brought the ark up. He wanted to have an earthly reign in Jerusalem. He wanted a place for Jehovah to reign. The ark was not currently in Jerusalem at the time, so David did the right thing at first, but in the wrong way. The ark was always to be carried on the shoulders of men, but David made a cart. We see here that because of this, Uzzah died after putting his hand to steady it. David became fearful, and he left the ark there, but then he eventually realized his mistake and corrected it to follow God's direction according to the ark, bearing it on their shoulders as God had commanded and leading it to the temple. He wanted to build a temple for the ark, but because he was a man of war, God did not allow it. However, David still prepared. He did not get jealous or rebellious, but he did what he could to make preparations for his son Solomon to eventually build the temple of God. He lived a surrendered and submissive life, and because of that, he often experienced victory. However, the sins of the parents are often passed to the third and fourth generation. He did have a family that would fall. The story of Absalom, which can be found in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 18. He loved Absalom, and he felt that he had wronged him, but the truth is that Absalom was, in many cases, a rebellious and a sinful man. But David still looked upon his son with love, but the truth is that unpunished sin can always become an uncontrollable giant later. David himself sinned many times. We know the story of Bathsheba, where David would look out and commit adultery with a woman that he had seen by killing her husband and then lying with her. The truth is, how can we see others' faults and not in ourselves? But the difference is between Saul and David is that David repented and Saul did not. In God's mercy, the second child, who would eventually become Solomon, of David and Bathsheba, was allowed to build the temple. David's next sin was when he numbered the children of Israel. God did not desire this to happen. It was against his will and command. And we see his demand, God's demand for obedience in this case. Many would suffer for the sin of one king. There was 7 years of famine. There was fleeing from an enemy, and there was pestilence. David would learn time and again that leaders have an awesome responsibility, but they have to answer to God for many people other than themselves. Becoming a leader, becoming the king, meant that they could not just follow God's will in their own life, but they in truth had to lead others and receive the responsibility and the outcome if they failed in their actions. David's restoration. David eventually did return to the Lord. Even through all the mistakes he would make, David would continually turn back to God. So here, this is another handout that we have. It shows the 7 outstanding events. And again, we went over them, but he was twice crowned king. He captured Jebus, or Jerusalem, for his capital city. He brought up the Ark of the Covenant. He desired to build a temple. He faced the rebellion of his own family. He committed several major sins, but he eventually was restored. And at the end of his life, when Solomon would take over and lead Israel into an even more prosperous and successful time period, David, in truth, lived a life after God. Is this also...
Just have to look at that.
All right. Okay, this is the next handout. The last handout is one that you'll have to look on your own. It shows questions and answers from the life of David. I highly suggest that you go and read through each one of these chapters. 1st and 2nd Samuel contain most of the story of both Saul and David. And not next class, but the next time that you'll come in for the United Kingdom, you'll be learning about Solomon and the fallen kingdom. So I would suggest you go ahead and read 1st and 2nd Samuel and begin to move on past that. Are there any other questions?
Hello, I'm sorry I came in late.
Sorry, say that again?
Sorry, it's Sandra here. I'm just saying, sorry I came in a bit late, but right at the beginning you said there were 3 main bits to Saul's life. You said there was a promise and then I missed the other 2.
Oh, okay.
Right at the beginning, I think.
Promise, decline, and failure.
The promise, the decline, and the failure.
Okay, thank you.
Question and answer. I didn't see it here.
I'm sorry?
Question and answer is not here.
What?
It's a question and answer.
No, you've done it. Oh, the question.
The question and answers. Do you all have the handout that is question and answers from the life of David?
I don't see it in here.
Don't think
Okay.
so.
I will get it. Sister Sabrina will send it to you, and I'll get you a hard copy. The other thing you have here is a paper that's stapled that says the spiritual truths to learn from Saul's life and David's life. And this is very, very good for you to go through and read. And really, if you want to be a preacher someday, there's 91 messages right here, okay? So it's very good for you to take time and look at that, all right? But I'll get you the other one about the questions and answers.
I want to thank you all for listening to me today. This is my first time teaching in a class. I apologize if I wasn't clear in any area. I do hope that I can continue to do this in the future. But thank you again, all of you, for being here today.
Thank
All
you.
right, take your break. We'll see you in 15 minutes.